I'm going to ask you a couple of names to see if you recognize any names.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of the name Kristil Krug? She may have been Grimsrod when you knew her.
Yeah.
And do you know a Daniel Krug?
No.
No? How do you know Kristil?
She was an ex-girlfriend.
She's an ex-girlfriend? How long's the ex? Like how long ago?
1999.
Oh, so like a long while
She was
ago.
my very first girlfriend ever.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
When's the last time you talked to Kristil? Has it been a minute?
It's been a minute,
Like since you moved from Durango?
yeah.
Yeah. So that would have been what, back in 2014?
Yeah.
Have you had any contact with anybody in that area since? Anybody, or have they contacted you at any time?
No.
I'm going to give you a phone number, and it's to a sergeant with the Broomfield Police Department.
Okay.
He would like you to reach out and talk to him.
All right.
They have an incident. I don't know the full details of their incident out there, and so I'll let him talk to you about that aspect. He had asked us to come out here to your house and talk with you. They were debating on, you do have an active warrant out of Broomfield Police Department, and they were debating on if they were going to have us arrest you or not. They are not going to have us arrest you on it. I'm going to advise you of the fact that you do have a warrant out of Colorado, and you can talk to this sergeant about the details of it, if that makes sense.
Broomfield, Colorado. Just north of Denver, nestled between busy highways and quiet neighborhoods, sits a community known for its safety, family life, and peaceful suburban streets. On the morning of December 14, 2023, nothing seemed out of place. The sun had risen over rows of homes decorated for the holiday season. Parents were heading to work. Children were being dropped off at school. Neighbors were beginning another ordinary Thursday. It was the kind of morning that passes without notice. The kind of morning where no one imagines a tragedy is already unfolding behind a closed garage door. Inside one home on Promontory Loop, 43-year-old Kristil Krug had already completed part of her daily routine. A mother of 3. A respected professional. A woman trying to hold her life together through weeks of growing fear. From the outside, everything appeared normal. But investigators would later allege that a deadly plan had already been set into motion. Hours later, concern began to grow. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Then Kristil's mother arrived at the home. At first, there was no reason to expect the unimaginable. It was supposed to be a routine visit. A normal stop at her daughter's house. But within moments, that ordinary day would become every parent's worst nightmare. Inside the garage, Kristil Krug was found dead. The scene immediately triggered a homicide investigation. Police responding to a welfare check discovered the 43-year-old mother with severe injuries inside the family garage. News of the killing spread quickly through the community. Friends were stunned. Neighbors struggled to understand what had happened. A mother of 3 had been murdered inside her own home. But as detectives began piecing together the events leading up to her death, they discovered something even more disturbing. Because Kristil had not been living a normal life in the weeks before she was killed. For months, she had been telling family members, friends, and police that someone was stalking her. The messages started unexpectedly. Texts from someone she believed she recognized. Emails that appeared to come from a man connected to her past. Then the communications became darker. More aggressive. More personal. The sender seemed to know details about her life. Her routines. Her family. Her movements. And according to investigators, the harassment escalated until Kristil became genuinely frightened for her safety. The messages were not random. They appeared targeted. Calculated. Designed to make her believe someone was watching. Someone who knew exactly where she was. And exactly what she was doing. Then came the photographs. Images that appeared to prove the sender was monitoring her life from a distance. Watching. Waiting. Following her. The fear became so serious that police were contacted. Reports were filed. Evidence was collected. Detectives began investigating what looked like an active stalking case. And for a time, the evidence seemed to point toward a shadow from Kristil's past. A former boyfriend living in another state. A man investigators would eventually locate and question. But as detectives dug deeper, the story stopped making sense. The timelines didn't fit. Certain details felt off. And hidden inside thousands of digital records was a trail leading somewhere no one expected. A trail that would transform this case from a stalking investigation into one of the most shocking murder prosecutions Colorado had seen in years. Because the deeper investigators looked, the more they began to question whether the stalker existed at all. Was Kristil truly being hunted by someone from her past? Or was the entire nightmare carefully manufactured? Who was sending the threats? Who created the fear? And who benefited from keeping Kristil terrified? Most importantly, how did a woman who spent weeks desperately trying to protect herself end up dead inside her own garage? And why would investigators eventually conclude that the person behind the stalking campaign had been standing beside her all along? To understand what happened inside that garage, we have to go back to the life Kristil Krug was trying so hard to protect. Before her name appeared in court documents. Before investigators began tracing digital evidence. Before national media outlets covered the case. Kristil Krug was simply a woman living a busy life in suburban Colorado. A mother. A professional. A daughter. A sister. A friend. And to the people who knew her best, she was far more than the victim at the center of a murder investigation. She was someone who brought energy into every room she entered. Someone who made people laugh. Someone whose life seemed filled with both ambition and creativity. Born in Boulder, Colorado, Kristil built a career that reflected her intelligence and determination. She worked as a biochemical engineer and project manager, spending nearly 2 decades with Agilent Technologies, a company serving the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries. Colleagues and family members described her as highly intelligent, driven, and deeply committed to her work. But science was only one side of who she was. Outside of work, Kristil had a passion for the arts. She loved dance. Modern dance. Performance. Creativity. Family members recalled how she balanced the precision of engineering with an equally strong love for self-expression. It was a combination that made her memorable to almost everyone she met. Friends described her as vibrant. Warm. Compassionate. The kind of person who genuinely enjoyed being around others. Her cousin later remembered the laughter that seemed to follow Kristil wherever she went. Family gatherings often became louder and more energetic the moment she arrived. According to relatives, she had a habit of bursting through the door carrying bags, stories, and excitement from whatever adventure or project she had been involved in that week. There was always conversation. Always energy. Always something happening. But above everything else, Kristil was a mother. And by all accounts, her children were the center of her world. Friends and family consistently described her as devoted to them. Their schedules. Their activities. Their future. Like many parents, much of her daily life revolved around balancing work responsibilities with school drop-offs, family events, sports, and the endless demands of raising children. To outsiders, the Krug family appeared to embody the image of suburban normalcy. A family home in Broomfield. 3 children. School activities. Work schedules. Neighborhood routines. The kind of life that blends quietly into communities across America. Kristil and Daniel Krug had married in 2007. Together, they built a life in Colorado and raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom home located on a corner lot in Broomfield. From the outside, there was little indication that anything was seriously wrong. Neighbors saw a family. Parents raising children. A couple navigating ordinary responsibilities. The image was familiar. Comfortable. Normal. And that's what made what happened later so difficult for many people to understand. Because behind the appearance of stability, some relatives would later describe growing tension inside the marriage. According to family members, Kristil often carried much of the responsibility within the household. She managed work. The children. Family obligations. And according to those closest to her, the strain had been building for some time. Still, the people who loved Kristil remember far more than the difficulties. They remember her sense of humor, her intelligence, her passion for life, her ability to move effortlessly between technical work and artistic expression. They remember a woman who seemed determined to keep moving forward no matter what challenges appeared in front of her. Her parents later spoke about how much she loved living life fully, trying new things, spending time with family, creating experiences with her children, building a future she believed in. Like many people in their 40s, Kristil appeared to be entering a new chapter. Focused on her family, focused on her career, focused on what came next. There were still goals she wanted to achieve, experiences she wanted to share with her children, dreams she was still working toward. No one around her imagined how little time remained. But as 2023 moved toward its final months, something began to change. The laughter became less frequent. The confidence people associated with Kristil started to fade. Family members noticed growing concern in her voice. Friends sensed increasing stress. And those closest to her could tell that something was weighing heavily on her mind. At first, the changes were subtle, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. But over time, the fear became harder to ignore. Something was troubling Kristil Krug. Something she could not seem to escape. And with each passing week, it appeared to be getting worse. At first, the message seemed strange, unexpected. The kind of text that might leave someone confused, but not necessarily alarmed. According to police records later reviewed during the investigation, one of the first messages arrived on October 2, 2023. The sender identified himself as Anthony. The message read, "Hope it's okay, I looked you up. I go to Boulder every few weeks and thought we could hook up. You game?" For many people, a message like that might have been dismissed. An old acquaintance reaching out. An awkward attempt to reconnect. A message easily ignored. And at first, that appears to be exactly what Kristil did. She didn't respond. She moved on with her day. But the messages didn't stop. Instead, they continued. And with each passing day, the tone began to change. What started as an unexpected contact soon became increasingly unsettling. The messages became more aggressive, more personal, and far more intrusive. According to investigators, the sender appeared determined to force his way back into Kristil's life. The reason the messages seemed believable was because they appeared connected to someone from her past. Years earlier, before her marriage, Kristil had dated a man named Jack Anthony Holland. The relationship had ended decades before. But according to information later presented in court, Holland had periodically attempted to reconnect over the years, making the sudden contact seem plausible. That detail mattered. Because when the messages arrived, Kristil wasn't dealing with a completely unknown name. She believed she knew exactly who was contacting her. And that belief would shape everything that followed. The sender appeared to know personal details. Private details. Things that made the messages feel authentic. Things that made it harder to dismiss them as a prank. Investigators later said the messages referenced information about Kristil's life that suggested the sender had knowledge of her routines and daily activities. Then the communications escalated. Texts became emails. Emails became repeated attempts at contact. New accounts appeared. Different phone numbers. Different email addresses. But the same disturbing theme remained. The sender wanted Kristil to believe he was obsessed with her. Some of the messages became sexually explicit. Others became possessive. And some crossed into outright threats. According to investigators, messages included statements such as, "You don't belong in that big house. You belong with me. I'll get rid of him and then we can be together. Help me get rid of him, then we can be together." The language was alarming. Not only because of what was being said, but because of who the sender appeared to be targeting. The messages increasingly focused on Kristil's marriage, her husband, her family life. The sender portrayed himself as someone desperate to be with her. Someone who believed he could remove obstacles standing in his way. And then came something even more disturbing. Evidence that suggested the sender wasn't simply messaging her. He appeared to be watching her. According to investigators, one message included a photograph of Kristil's vehicle parked outside a dentist's office during an appointment she had attended. Another included an image showing Daniel Krug getting out of his vehicle at work. To Kristil, these weren't random threats anymore. The messages suddenly felt real. Whoever was contacting her appeared to know where she was. Where her husband was. What she was doing. And when she was doing it. The illusion was becoming frighteningly convincing. As the weeks passed, the harassment intensified. New messages arrived. New accounts appeared. The communications became increasingly difficult to predict. And increasingly difficult to escape. According to family members and investigators, Kristil became genuinely frightened by what was happening. Fear began replacing certainty. Questions replaced answers. Who was really sending the messages? Why now? Why after so many years? And how did this person seem to know so much about her life? The emotional toll became impossible to ignore. The woman friends described as energetic and confident was now dealing with constant anxiety. Every notification could bring another message. Every unfamiliar vehicle could raise suspicion. Every unexpected sound could trigger concern. There was also something else weighing heavily on her mind. Her children. According to reports, Kristil's fear wasn't limited to her own safety. Like many stalking victims, she worried about the people closest to her. The possibility that whoever was targeting her could also be watching her family. The harassment was no longer an inconvenience. It was becoming part of her daily life. Part of her routine. Part of her thinking. And with every new message, the sense of danger appeared to grow. Soon, the communications became impossible to ignore. The texts. The emails. The threats. The obsession. All of it seemed to point toward someone who refused to let go. Someone who wanted Kristil afraid. Someone who wanted her constantly looking over her shoulder. And then something happened that changed everything. Something that convinced Kristil Krug she wasn't simply receiving messages anymore. She was being watched. Then came the moment that changed everything for Kristil Krug. It wasn't just the messages anymore. It wasn't just the tone. It wasn't just the repeated contact from an unknown number. It was proof, or at least what appeared to be proof, that someone was physically tracking her movements. According to later investigative findings reported in the case, Kristil began receiving photographs that suggested real-time surveillance. Images that showed locations she had just visited. Places she recognized. Places she had not told anyone she was going to. Parking lots. Business entrances. Moments from her daily routine that should have been private. And yet, somehow, they were being documented. To Kristil, this was no longer harassment from a distance. It felt closer. Too close. The implication was clear. Whoever was sending the messages wasn't just talking. They were watching. From that point on, fear began to shape Kristil's daily life. Not in dramatic outbursts. But in small, constant adjustments. The kind of changes people make when they believe they are no longer safe in ordinary spaces. Every outing required caution. Every routine became something to reconsider. She began looking over her shoulder more often. Checking surroundings that once felt familiar. Paying attention to details that previously wouldn't have mattered. Vehicles parked too long. Strangers in public spaces. Unfamiliar numbers on her phone. The normal rhythm of life slowly shifted into something heavier. Something more guarded. Something more uncertain. Investigators later noted that stalking victims often begin modifying their behavior without even realizing how much they are changing. Kristil was no different. She started adjusting her schedule. Altering routes. Being more careful about where she went and when she went there. Things that once felt automatic now required thought. Even simple errands carried a sense of unease. And the more she tried to regain control, the more the uncertainty seemed to grow. Because the messages continued. And the images continued. And the feeling that someone was watching never fully went away. As the situation escalated, Kristil turned to the people closest to her. Family members noticed the change in her tone. Friends noticed the stress. Those conversations became increasingly serious. Concern replaced casual reassurance. People around her began trying to make sense of what she was experiencing. Was this really an ex-boyfriend? Was someone targeting her specifically? Or was something else going on? Together, they attempted to piece it together. They reviewed messages. They discussed possible motives. They tried to identify patterns. But nothing was clear. Every explanation seemed incomplete. Every theory led to more questions than answers. And still, the messages continued. For Kristil, the emotional weight of the situation grew heavier with time. Stalking cases often carry a unique kind of psychological pressure. Because the threat is not always visible. It is not always direct. It exists in uncertainty. In anticipation. In the feeling that danger could appear at any moment. Kristil was living inside that uncertainty. Every notification carried tension. Every unfamiliar interaction carried suspicion. Even moments of normal life were no longer fully normal. Sleep becomes difficult. Focus becomes harder. Peace of mind begins to fade. And slowly, the world that once felt safe begins to feel unpredictable. For Kristil, that sense of security was breaking down. At this point, the situation had moved far beyond discomfort. It was no longer something she could simply ignore. It was no longer something she could explain away. The fear had become persistent. The messages had become relentless. And the belief that someone was watching her had become impossible to shake. Kristil Krug reached a turning point. She decided she could not handle the situation alone. She needed help. And for the first time in the investigation, police officially became involved. When Kristil Krug finally involved law enforcement, the situation officially moved from private fear to a documented stalking investigation. Police reports were filed. Complaints were recorded. And for the first time, the threats she had been receiving were placed into an official investigative framework. Kristil provided what she had. Messages. Emails. Screenshots. Records of communications that had been building over weeks. To investigators, it appeared they were dealing with a digital stalking case, one that required technical analysis as much as traditional detective work. Detectives began by doing what they always do in cases like this. They reviewed the messages in detail. They examined timestamps. They analyzed writing patterns. They looked for inconsistencies. They attempted to trace accounts and phone numbers linked to the harassment. Every message became a piece of evidence. Every account became a potential lead. Every digital footprint became a possible path toward identifying the sender. At first glance, the case seemed to point in a familiar direction. An alleged ex-boyfriend. A man from Kristil's past. Someone who, according to the narrative forming around the case, may have had a reason to reappear. The investigation initially began to narrow in on that possibility. A former romantic partner. A name tied to Kristil's earlier life. A person who, on paper, appeared to be the most logical suspect. There were reasons for this focus. The messages referenced a past relationship. The sender claimed emotional familiarity. And the harassment seemed to be rooted in obsession and personal history. But as detectives examined the situation further, complications began to emerge. Distance became a factor. The suspected individual lived out of state. Alibi information did not immediately align with the timing of the messages. And investigators faced a critical problem. They had suspicion, but not confirmation. They had motive, but not proof. And most importantly, they had no direct evidence linking him to the digital accounts being used. Digital stalking cases are notoriously difficult to solve. Because identity online can be hidden. Accounts can be created and deleted. Numbers can be masked. Locations can be disguised. And messages can be routed through multiple layers of anonymity. At this stage, investigators were still working within those limitations. Nothing about the case clearly pointed to a single, confirmed suspect. And while the former boyfriend remained under consideration, the evidence was not yet strong enough to build a case around him. So detectives continued digging. Looking deeper. Tracing further. Searching for any connection that might explain who was behind the harassment campaign. What investigators could not yet see. What Kristil herself could not yet know. Was that the entire framework of the stalking case was already built on deception. The source of the messages was not a distant stranger. Not a forgotten relationship from the past. Not someone watching from afar. The truth was still hidden beneath layers of digital manipulation. And the real sender was far closer than anyone had imagined. Close enough to know her schedule. Close enough to observe her routines. Close enough to shape her fear from within her own daily life. But at that moment in the investigation, none of that was visible. While investigators searched for what they believed was a dangerous external stalker, the person allegedly responsible for the messages was still active. Still communicating. Still constructing the illusion. And still, according to prosecutors, creating fear from inside Kristil Krug's own world. While investigators worked to identify an outside stalker, they were unknowingly circling around a suspect who, according to prosecutors, had been inside the home all along. A man who appeared completely ordinary. A husband. A father. A working professional. Someone who, on the surface, blended seamlessly into the same suburban life Kristil Krug was trying to protect. His name was Daniel Krug. To neighbors and acquaintances, he was not the center of suspicion. He was not described as volatile or alarming. He was simply part of a family unit living an otherwise normal life in Broomfield, Colorado. A household with 3 children. School routines. Work schedules. The kind of life that, from the outside, rarely raises concern. But according to prosecutors, that normal appearance would later be used to conceal something far more disturbing. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors alleged that Daniel Krug was not merely a passive observer of the situation unfolding around his wife. Instead, they argued he was actively shaping it. Behind the scenes. In digital spaces. Through accounts that did not immediately trace back to him. Investigators later alleged the use of fake online identities, anonymous communications, and burner-style digital activity designed to obscure the origin of the stalking messages. On the surface, the harassment appeared to come from a former relationship. But behind that appearance, prosecutors claimed, was a carefully constructed deception. One that required planning, consistency, and sustained manipulation over time. According to investigators, the alleged strategy was not random. It was structured. Messages were not only sent, they were crafted to create belief. Belief that Kristil was being targeted. Belief that someone from her past had returned. Belief that she was being watched. Some communications, prosecutors claimed, were designed to mimic obsession from a former boyfriend. Others escalated fear by suggesting proximity. And some appeared to include details that reinforced the idea of surveillance. The effect, investigators argued, was psychological pressure. A growing sense that danger was both personal and unavoidable. And critically, that it was coming from outside her home. One of the most significant aspects of the prosecution's theory was misdirection. As Kristil reported the stalking, attention naturally turned outward. Toward individuals from her past. Toward people who might have motive. Toward anyone who could plausibly fit the profile of an obsessed ex-partner. Investigators initially followed that path as well. But according to prosecutors, that direction was part of the design. A constructed narrative that led attention away from the actual source of the messages. While law enforcement searched for an external suspect, the alleged perpetrator remained in the closest possible proximity. Inside the same home. Within the same daily routines. Within the same private life that was being disrupted. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not only the alleged deception, but the emotional reality of it. Because Kristil was not just receiving threats from an unknown source. She was, according to the prosecution's narrative, confiding in her husband about the fear those threats created. Seeking reassurance. Trying to understand what was happening. Trying to protect herself and her children. And all the while, the person she may have looked to for safety was allegedly the same person creating the fear. The psychological weight of that possibility is what makes this case stand apart. It transforms the story from a simple stalking investigation into something far more unsettling. A situation where trust, fear, and proximity were all entangled. Then came December 14, 2023. A date that would mark the end of uncertainty. The end of unanswered messages. And the beginning of a homicide investigation that would change everything investigators thought they understood about Kristil Krug's final days. By the morning of December 14, 2023, Kristil Krug's life had already been under weeks of escalating fear. But outwardly, it was still a routine day. A school morning. A weekday morning. The kind of morning that repeats itself in thousands of homes across Colorado. According to investigative findings later outlined by prosecutors, Kristil began her day in a familiar pattern. She handled morning responsibilities at home. She prepared for the day ahead. And, like many parents, she made sure her children were taken care of before focusing on anything else. Her children were dropped off for the day. The house grew quiet. And Kristil returned home. At that point, investigators believe she was alone inside the residence. A normal routine. On a day that would soon become anything but normal. According to the prosecution's allegations, what followed was not random violence, but a planned encounter inside the home. A confrontation that took place in a private space. Inside the garage area of the residence. Prosecutors argue that Daniel Krug was already inside or positioned in a way that allowed him access to Kristil at the critical moment. What happened next, according to their theory, was an attack that escalated quickly. The details presented in court filings describe a violent confrontation resulting in Kristil suffering fatal injuries inside the garage. Authorities later identified the garage as the central location of the crime scene. A confined, domestic space. A place typically associated with routine life. Not tragedy. Inside that space, investigators documented physical evidence consistent with a violent struggle. The garage became the focal point of the forensic examination. Blood evidence. Disturbance patterns. Signs of a rapid and forceful incident. All contributing to the conclusion that Kristil's death occurred there. For investigators, the challenge was not just determining what happened, but understanding the sequence of events that led to it. Because nothing about the earlier stalking investigation suggested a direct confrontation inside the home was imminent. Yet, according to prosecutors, that is where the case ultimately led. In the hours following Kristil's death, investigators focused heavily on Daniel Krug's movements. According to public reporting, he left the home and proceeded with what appeared to be a normal workday routine. There was no immediate public indication of a crisis unfolding inside the residence. This behavior later became a point of investigative focus. Because while Kristil had not been seen or heard from, life outside the home appeared to continue as usual. At least on the surface. Inside the investigation, however, that contrast raised questions. Questions about timing, awareness, and actions taken immediately after the incident. The first sign that something was wrong came when concern began to build among family members. Kristil was not responding. Her whereabouts were unclear. And eventually, her mother went to the home to check on her daughter. What she encountered would lead directly to the discovery of Kristil's body inside the garage. Emergency services were called immediately. Police responded to the scene. And the residence was secured as a crime scene. The atmosphere shifted instantly from concern to a homicide investigation. First responders confirmed a fatal incident had occurred inside the home. Investigators began documenting the scene, collecting evidence, establishing timelines, and identifying areas of forensic significance within the garage. What had once been a private family residence was now a controlled investigation zone. Every detail mattered. Every trace was examined. Every timeline was reconstructed. But even at this early stage, the full picture was still far from clear. At first, it appeared to be a tragic and isolated domestic homicide. But as investigators began digging deeper, they would soon uncover something far more complex. A digital footprint. A pattern of communication. And a trail of evidence that would begin to reshape everything they thought they knew about the case. Because the investigation was only just beginning. And the truth behind Kristil Krug's final days was still waiting to be uncovered. After Kristil Krug's death, investigators shifted from a physical crime scene analysis to something far more complex. A digital investigation. Because in modern cases like this, the most important evidence is often not found in what people see, but in what they leave behind online. Detectives began a full forensic review of electronic devices. Phones were examined. Computers were analyzed. Accounts linked to communications were reviewed. And most importantly, metadata became a critical focus. Time stamps. Login histories. Device connections. Digital footprints that cannot easily be erased or faked without leaving traces behind. Every message Kristil had received was re-examined. Every account that had contacted her was traced backward through layers of digital activity. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. As the analysis deepened, investigators began linking the harassment campaign to internal digital activity within the same household. The timeline of messages aligned with periods where access to devices and accounts could be connected to someone physically close to Kristil. Location data and account usage patterns became key points of comparison. And what initially appeared to be external stalking began to show signs of internal origin. According to prosecutors, the digital evidence ultimately pointed toward Daniel Krug as the source of the communications that had terrorized Kristil in the weeks leading up to her death. One of the most significant turning points in the investigation was the elimination of the former boyfriend as a viable suspect. Once examined through digital records and corroborated timelines, investigators concluded there was no sufficient evidence linking him to the communications or the harassment campaign. The identity of the ex-boyfriend stalker began to fall apart under forensic scrutiny. What once appeared to be a credible external threat was now understood to be a constructed narrative. A false persona built through digital deception. And as that theory collapsed, another possibility became unavoidable. The source of the stalking messages was not outside Kristil's life. It was inside it. Once the digital evidence was fully analyzed and corroborated, law enforcement moved forward. Authorities announced the arrest of Daniel Krug in connection with the investigation. The case that had begun as a stalking complaint had now officially transformed into a homicide prosecution. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had seen a normal family dynamic were confronted with allegations of deception and murder. Media coverage intensified rapidly. Local reports quickly became national attention. Because the narrative of the case had fundamentally changed. What was once believed to be a mysterious external stalker was now being investigated as a domestic homicide involving digital impersonation and manipulation. The story that began as a stalking investigation had completely transformed. It was no longer about an unknown threat from the outside. It was about what allegedly happened inside a family home. A private relationship. A constructed digital deception. And a homicide investigation that would now move into the courtroom. When the case reached trial, prosecutors laid out a theory built on two interconnected claims. That Kristil Krug had been the victim of a calculated stalking campaign. And that the person responsible for that campaign was also responsible for her death. The prosecution's argument centered on planning and premeditation. They alleged that the stalking messages were not random acts of harassment, but part of a deliberate strategy to control perception and direct suspicion away from the true source. They presented digital evidence, communication records, timeline analysis, and forensic connections between devices and accounts. Their case focused heavily on manipulation. Not only of Kristil, but of the investigation itself. The defense challenged the interpretation of the digital evidence. They questioned assumptions about account attribution. They argued that the prosecution's narrative relied heavily on inference rather than direct observation. And they pushed back against claims that all communications could be definitively traced to a single individual. As in many digital forensics cases, the defense emphasized ambiguity and the possibility of alternative explanations. During the trial, investigators and digital forensic experts played a central role. They explained how data was collected, how timelines were reconstructed, and how connections between devices and accounts were established. Family members also provided emotional testimony, describing Kristil's fear in the weeks leading up to her death, describing the impact the stalking allegations had on her daily life, and describing the shock of what was ultimately discovered. Each testimony added another layer to the story the jury had to consider. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Daniel Krug was convicted of first-degree murder and related charges. The decision marked the formal conclusion of the trial phase. The stalking investigation had fully transitioned into a murder conviction. Following the conviction, sentencing was handed down. Daniel Krug received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. An additional consecutive sentence was also imposed for related offenses. The courtroom proceedings concluded. But the impact of the case continued far beyond the legal outcome. For Kristil's family, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not relief. Public reactions ranged from shock to disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the image of a normal suburban family with the allegations presented in court. Media coverage continued to revisit the central theme of the case: a woman who believed she was being stalked, and the unsettling possibility that the threat came from much closer than she ever realized. With the trial concluded and the sentence delivered, the legal process had reached its end. But the story of Kristil Krug remains one of the most disturbing reminders of how deception can exist in plain sight, and how the truth, in some cases, only becomes visible when it is already too late. When you step back from every piece of evidence, every message, every report, every timeline, every courtroom argument, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. Kristil Krug spent weeks living inside a fear she could not fully understand. A fear built from messages she believed were coming from a stalker. A fear reinforced by what appeared to be surveillance. A fear that grew stronger with every passing day. She reported it. She documented it. She tried to make sense of it. She sought help. According to prosecutors and the jury's verdict, the person she believed was hunting her, the person she thought might be watching her, the person she feared could harm her, never existed as she was led to believe. Instead, the threat she was reacting to was part of a much more complex and devastating reality. One that unfolded inside her own life. Inside her own home. Beyond the facts of the case, this story raises deeper questions that extend far beyond one investigation. Trust. How easily trust can be built, and how deeply it can be exploited. Manipulation. How perception can be shaped through carefully constructed narratives. Coercive control. How fear can be used not just as a reaction, but as a tool. Domestic violence warning signs. How danger is not always loud or obvious, but can exist behind closed doors, beneath ordinary routines. Psychological abuse. How trauma can be created not only through physical harm, but through sustained fear and uncertainty. These themes are not just legal concepts. They are human realities that appear in cases far too often. But beyond the investigation, beyond the courtroom, beyond the digital evidence, there was a person at the center of this story. Kristil Krug was a mother, a daughter, a friend, a woman building a life around her children and her future. Her absence is felt most deeply not in headlines or case files, but in the lives of those who knew her personally. Her children, her family, the people who shared everyday moments with her, the people who knew her laughter, her presence, her energy, and the life she was trying to protect. Sometimes the most frightening threats don't come from strangers hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they come from the people sitting across the dinner table. And for Kristil Krug, that realization came far too late. If you found this case informative, make sure to subscribe to Dark Case Files for more in-depth true crime documentaries. What do you think was the most shocking part of this case? The fake stalker? The digital deception? Or the fact that investigators say the entire nightmare was created by someone inside her own home? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next case.